Testing. Good.
Okay, with those successful tests, we'll get started. Good evening, and thanks for coming this evening. I'm Lisa Hostetler, curator in charge of the Department of Photography here at the George Eastman Museum, and the curator of the exhibition we're presenting this evening, Tanya Marcuse, Woven. The show features Tanya's latest body of work, and she's here to talk about it with us thanks to the support of the Libson Visiting Artists Fund. And I also want to thank the sponsors of the exhibition, the Rubens Family Foundation, for enabling the museum to present the show. Tonight's program will consist of a conversation between Tanya and me about her work and some of the images in the slideshow that we prepared. And then we'll open the discussion up with questions from you. Afterwards, Tanya will be signing copies of her new publication, Fruitless Fallen Woven, in the peristyle outside of the exhibition gallery. And to begin, I'll just give a very brief synopsis of Tanya's background. She received her BA in Art History and Studio Art from Oberlin College and her MFA in Photography from the Yale University School of Art. Her photographs are in numerous museum collections, including the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art, the George Eastman Museum, Yale Art Gallery, and the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, and the Library of Congress. She's published 3 monographs, and her work has been featured and reviewed in a number of publications, including the New Yorker, Art Forum, Art News, and the New York Times. Marcuse won a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2003 to pursue her project Undergarments and Armor, and she's got a number of other fellowships and awards for her artwork. So now let's get to woven. So I want to begin by talking about the basics of the work that we're showing. So,
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
Because I would like to also say thank you to you for envisioning this in the first place, and also just to the museum, to all these, so many people that helped to make the show and all of this possible, because it's been just a fantastic experience working with everyone. And I think it's hard working with artists, probably, but the show, like, it's hard to make us happy, where we really just feel like everything is like fully realized in every detail. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for the work. And thanks to Nick Marshall, who led the installation team and is around here somewhere. Okay, woven 1. What is the material in woven 1, and how was it made?
Look at it. I can't impress upon you enough the difference between looking at this here and the actual thing. This is better than looking at it on your phone, for example. But there's nothing quite like looking at the real print. So this is woven number 1 because it was the first of the piece. You'll see that the pieces all have numbers: woven number 31, woven number 4. That actually came from the practical reason of numbering them as they go, but also the reference to the way Jackson Pollock numbers his images. So I gave actually quite a bit of thought to that. So this piece began with a kind of idea about, it was summertime, I live in the Hudson Valley, there are fresh cherries, but kind of this idea of the hinge between beauty and seduction and danger. So on one hand, there's fairy roses and ripe cherries, but they're also, it's a landscape that's filled with snakes and other little creatures, little chipmunk tails and mice and things like that. So it really, this piece, kind of like I was just talking about my project Fallen. So both of those projects are really where I picture the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve have been kicked out, right? It's like they've eaten the fruit, their eyes are open, they're banished from the garden, no one's there to tend it. And this is kind of like the way I imagine or enact what that landscape looks like, a place of incredible fecundity and beauty and kind of deliciousness and sensuality, but it's also a place where mortality has entered the garden. So life and death are woven together, which is, of course, why the project is called Woven. It also refers to how I create these. So I didn't just find this in a cherry orchard on the ground. They're built on a wooden frame that I designed specifically for this purpose. And then I collect and compose over anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months before a final shoot that happens in like a single day.
So the first body of work that I became aware of, now I want to back up a little bit to find out how we got to this place. Or got to Woven. So the first work that I became aware of was undergarments and armor, which here's some examples here. There are these beautiful platinum prints, not very big, and they really draw on sort of historic garments, armor, undergarments, and reference the body. How did you get from arms and armor, or undergarments and armor, to woven? And I know you followed the fruitless, fallen, woven trajectory, but each one of those has its own special sort of idea. So.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and not an easy question to answer succinctly, but I'll try. So really for many years, I would say even 15 years or so, my work was focused on exploring ideas that had to do with the body and the archive. And I was interested in the relationship between the body and the archive, partly because of my interest in the absence or presence of the body. So for example, the undergarments in the Metropolitan Museum of Art are collected from all kinds of different places, including people's, hand-me-downs from grandmothers and things like that end up kind of getting, migrating into a cultural archive. But the body is gone, right? So we're left with this kind of shells of the body. So undergarments and armor, both of those kinds of objects are sort of like sculptures of the body that outlast the wearer. And this was my fascination. And then my fascination with the two together, right? They're sort of male and female and hard and soft and inside and outside and public and private, and kind of all these dualities, which I've always loved. I've always been drawn to kind of things that are sort of contradictory or opposing, and then exploring that relationship. I was printing in platinum for a good 15 years. We're making, it's a process from the 1860s, 70s, and contact printed from a 4x5 negative. So it's a huge jump, right, between making a thing which is this big versus 5 by 10 feet or 5 by 13 feet. But one thing that I think is interesting is that I've always been interested in scale and object specificity. Like many photographers feel like the sort of how the image is realized may not be quite so particular in terms of whether it's 20 by 24 or something like sort of come in different sizes, like a dress, but it wouldn't necessarily change the nature of the dress. Whereas for me, the experience of scale and those decisions about scale and object, I chose platinum printing not because it was old or nostalgic, but because I was interested in something very drawing-like about the quality of the surface of the print and the way that it kind of invited the viewer in very deeply and intensely to look at it very intimately. And then, yeah, so should I try to shift to this? Or did you have a question?
No, I was thinking about, you had just talked about how the woven works were like Adam and Eve after the fall, and their absence and the absence of the body from the undergarments and armor, that sort of connected for me, because what's not there
Yes,
being as important as what's there.
And actually, again, as as the works look visually in the frontispiece of Undergarments and Armor has a little passage from the Song of Solomon, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. But in my original mock-up of the book, it also had, and the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves or whatever aprons, depending on the translation. So that passage has been on my mind for a very long time.
Yeah. Okay, so then from those to the trees.
Yeah, so there's a lot of connective tissue in here that we're not going to get so much into. Like there was a whole other entire body of work called Wax Bodies, where I was photographing anatomical models in museums in Italy, but that brought me to working in color, which was really important. And I was still working with the view camera, but I was living in the Hudson Valley, which is about 4 hours south and east of here. And so I was, surrounded by orchards and gardens, and I started becoming a gardener myself very gradually. And one of the things that I was most keenly sort of moved by were the cycles of the apple trees in different stages of bloom and bareness. And I began making these photographs of trees. This is fruitless number 1 up here, which was an apple in winter that was sort of in this almost sort of miraculous way still holding its fruit. And that was the beginning of a 5-year project, which I didn't really define as a project, like I just was doing it. And I was a little embarrassed about it, like my friends would ask what I was working on, and I was like, I'm photographing trees, like I don't know. Like it just didn't seem like cerebral enough, or like, they're so beautiful. Like it's just so that evolved into quite, I'm just trying to remember, so most of the photographs are like very, very simple, vertical, kind of iconic images where I'm kind of like down on my knees in the snow or in the mud. Everything that I do seems to make me very, very dirty. And then looking up at the tree, very, very reverential experience to kind of beholding in a kind of awe or wonder, and feeling like my my process was a way of almost like honoring through description and attention the beauty of the tree. One of the things I did a couple of summers ago was I was on a fellowship residency at McDowell Colony, in particular to spend time making sense of this earlier project, because I wasn't particularly organized about it. I'm actually been meticulously organized about Fallen and Woven, partly because of my more lax methods here. But so, for example, I kind of was able to put together trees that I had photographed over these many years in different seasons, some until the tree was dying. And that also really helped me to work on the book, Fruitless, Fallen, Woven, and helped me to make that decision that I wanted to have the book a 3-part experience.
What's the scale of these prints?
So these I actually, in the beginning, was only making as 4x5 platinum prints, but then I began making them as 40x50 pigment prints, so either tiny or large, and then I began photographing the fruit beneath the trees. So that was one of those sort of like artistic revelation moments where, every time I would go out, I would kind of take this position where I'm looking kind of upward at the tree, and then I just suddenly looked down, and I couldn't believe I wasn't like seeing this all the time, that there were all these little just sort of accidental still lives beneath the trees of the apples, the fallen apples, which of course was like the fallen fruit of the tree of knowledge, or the tree of good and evil. At least in my mind, it was sort of this combination of those things, right? The actual fallen fruit a few miles from my house, but then this kind of more allegorical way of seeing it. But by this time, I had gone back and forth to Italy a few times to work on my project, Wax Bodies, and had started working in color. So I tried these in color. So this was one of those like particularly key artistic moments where I had a 4x5 film, I had black and white on one side, color on the other, and just like shifted over. And then when I looked at it later, it was really exciting. And there were some other changes, like I had begun collecting apples from underneath the trees, and I'd be standing out in an orchard for 8 hours waiting for good light. Emily understands this. Like freezing or something like that. And then I just decided to start collecting the apples, and I would take my whole family. My husband is over here, my kids aren't here, but they would come with me, and we would go rotten apple picking, and collect all these like apples in like perfect stages of decay. They're like, oh, you want this one? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's perfect. It's like kind of burgundy, and it's got hollowed out on one side. And then I set up these like amazing still lifes all around my yard. And I thought, oh, I'll just photograph them like as they're decaying. But then the deer came and ate them all. So then I went back out again, and I put them in the freezer. And that was also a kind of accidental discovery of preserving the fruit in various stages of decay, and then orchestrating the photographs later. And there was a kind of another side effect of this was that I kind of discovered this beautiful frosty quality that happened when I took the apples out of the freezer and they're acclimating, to the new temperature, right? Why we have to make appointments weeks in advance if you want to see a color photograph from the Eastman's collection, right?
For any photograph.
Right.
No, it's cool story.
Right, because you don't want this to happen, right? You don't want the photograph to like get a frosty condensation on it. Anyway, so this became kind of a method, and then so in Fallen, I'm finding places out in the landscape, sometimes scouting for very particular places, sometimes just using my backyard, and then kind of like, I don't know, infiltrating, it sounds a little too military, but using it like a stage set and thinking almost of the apples as characters, and then choreographing an image.
Okay. Should we show a few
Yeah,
more?
sure. This is one of the ones very central to the series. It's got a little snake and some bats. Actually, just one bat. And I feel like it's got some other creepy things in it. And then these hollowed out apples. So very much like the ground, imagining the ground of Eden with like the snake and these sort of more sinister creatures like the bat that would have come in after the fall of Adam and Eve.
Okay, so then I know that this one was important to getting to wovens.
It was, yeah. So this piece, which was a lot of my pieces I'm inspired or referencing in some more general way, a painting or sometimes something literary that's been really important to me. But this piece actually was very specifically in conversation with a painting by Bruegel, which looks like a painting by Bosch, but it's by Bruegel, called Fall of the Rebel Angels. And we can actually show that too, because oops, I got the wrong one. Where did it go? Oh, here it is. Yeah. And I'm kind of interested in like the lower 2/3 where the Archangel Michael is banishing the angels that have rebelled against God, and they're sort of transmogrifying into these creatures down in hell. So the piece, So I'm using some of the same elements, like the swallowtail wings were really important to me. And then you can see snakes and rodents, and I was using cicadas as the sort of like, they both had this very angelic quality, their wings, but also kind of demonic, little red eyes. But when I was preparing for a show at Julie Saul Gallery in 2014, I really wanted there to be a kind of centerpiece of the show, like almost like an altar. And I had been making those pieces around 40 by 50 inches, but then decided to make this one. It was about 60 by 75. And that was the largest piece I had ever made. But it changed the experience for the viewer, I believed, where it began to engage the peripheral vision and kind of create a much more intense sense of immersion. And then that really did lead to woven, because I began wanting to work at this larger scale and kind of heighten that sense of scale and immersion.
So with the next ones, and maybe we can kind of go through some of these woven works as you're talking, but when you were making the audio tour, which is available on your smartphone or by calling a number, and you can get the stops in the gallery, but you and Eve, Tanya's daughter, who's also an author, talked about the iconographical index that you had started to collect, and how, and I was hoping you could sort of talk again for us about how that led to the book Entries on Eve.
So it was actually really interesting. Your question about that made me remember that at the point where my daughter and I began this collaboration, I hadn't even begun woven. I had just barely begun woven, but I had this little side activity as I was making the fallen pieces, was that I was kind of making this little index of the kind of iconography of the works. Some of them not necessarily highly symbolic, but like even just collecting images of frogs, of cherries, and then colors. So they were sort of these different kind of categories that I was making, and I made an installation piece called the Iconographic Index. And then my daughter Eve, who was then was she like a junior in high school, I think, when we started, something like that. Very gifted writer, very gifted with languages, like my husband is. He's a classics scholar and philolog. So she was going to write poems in relationship to each of these sort of entries. And we were looking in our encyclopedias we had these Encyclopedia Britannica in 1957, but we would look in there for kind of ideas about how the references in these entries, but we ended up using the encyclopedia as the text for the book. So we worked on this artist book for about 3 years, which ended up incorporating the images from Woven and Fallen, which you can see a couple of pages from in the show, and the text is incorporated in the wall, which was Lisa's amazing idea. Yeah.
Or somebody here. I think to show a couple of others, and maybe these some details. So like number 27 here, this is the one in the gallery. There's a botanical illustrator that you worked with, and maybe talk about the natural history diorama influence on these works.
Yeah, so this was 2017, this piece, and up until this point, I really hadn't been working with living creatures. Got really, really good at posing dead things to look alive, or sometimes I would just let a dead thing look dead, or sometimes you really couldn't make it look alive no matter how hard you tried. But in this piece, I wanted to use living creatures, and my inspiration actually for this whole giant piece was actually just the metamorphosis of the butterfly. I had raised monarchs with my son Jonah. He once like captured two mating monarchs, and we ended up, she laid, the female lay eggs in milkweed in our house. We had like, I don't know, 40 little eggs, and then they all hatched, and we had cocoons. It was like incredible, like totally science fiction amazing. So this giant piece was all inspired by that, and in the piece are little cocoons. You know, they're tiny, and there's also living frogs and a little salamander over. I don't know if you can see it, but in the upper right, there's a little stinkhorn mushroom for the people who know mycology out here, and on that is a tiny fly. So the orchestration of the pieces has gotten a bit more, I would say, even more elaborate than number one, because number one, even though it was quite elaborate, it's sort of like once it was done, and then there's the process of photographing the piece. Whereas in the recent pieces, I've been adding pools of water. This has a little pool of water. I think you can sort of see it in here, that I create on the frame. And there's living frogs in the piece. And it's very much in conversation with these natural history museum dioramas that I've loved since I was a little girl. I grew up in New York City, and we would take field trips to the Natural History Museum, and I actually use a lot of the techniques of the diorama artists. I borrow from them. I get information from the Natural History Museum about snow or various kinds of techniques of creating something that looks real. It is real, or looks, I don't know. But I love the idea of the real creatures in these scenes, whereas like the dioramas have like a gorilla or a bird that it's real, but it's of course dead and taxidermied, made with this kind of duality of plunder and imperialist adventure, but also conservation. So it's very, very complicated, and I kind of love that. I love that whole rich history.
Yeah, and you also talk a lot about sort of real and fantastical things being combined. I know in the Encyclopedia Britannica that you drew upon entries for entries on Eden. What was striking was that some of the entries had this language that sounded very scientific or factual, but that it was about like a place like Eden or a mythological place. So it's like really looking and trying to map something that's may or may not be real. And so I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that duality and the fact that it's important to you. I know it's very important to you that these are photographs and not drawings or paintings.
Yeah. I'm actually going to start with the last part. Maybe it's because it's a little bit more answerable than some of the other part, but I'll just start there about the because sometimes when people look at these, they're like, oh, these look like paintings, or they, and certainly in terms of my inspiration, I'm so interested in, not just interested, but just, you know, enraptured and engaged with medieval tapestry, with Jackson Pollock, with Bosch. It's so important to the work. Like in particular, The Garden of Earthly Delights by Bosch, which I saw in person in 2009 when I had some of my work from Undergarments and Armor in a show in Madrid. And all I did the whole time I was in Madrid was just look at this painting. I mean, there were the amazing Velázquez and Goya in the museum too, but it was particularly important because at the time I thought I might want to make a 3-part series. a 3-part piece, or makes pieces that would all be in 3 parts, like this kind of altarpiece format, where you would have like the lusty earth in the center, heaven and hell. I was also studying Dante, which has the same 3-part canticles, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. But I found that for me, rather than being able to compartmentalize these experiences visually or conceptually, it all seemed to be about the interweaving of these realms and these experiences. So in a single day, you might have like a kind of ecstatic moment, and 5 minutes later, 3 hours later, like something very, horrifying. And just it seemed like as I was getting older, so much of life had to do with the interweaving of, pleasure and pain, of life and death. So rather than try to make things in compartments, I wanted to make pieces that were trying to make something really whole and coherent out of these opposite realms. And then, Sure, and then the fact that they're photographs is absolutely key. Every now and then someone will visit my studio and they'll say like, oh, can we show the wooden frame that and I'm like, well, that's not a piece. It's not, it's just completely like a means to an end. And actually when you see it, it really doesn't, it might look kind of cool, but it doesn't look anything like how the camera sees it. Which is, so even though I'm not going out in the world, right? When you go out in the world with a camera, if I wanted to take a photograph in this room right now, even with my phone, I would take a little rectangle out of this bigger world that I'm seeing. So I would subtract that out by using the framing device of the camera, this little window, this like sort of extracting of the world, which is a way that the photographer says, this is what's important, what's in, what's inside these lines. And you make meaning that way, right? I talked with my students about this a lot, and about not putting things in there for arbitrarily. So even if you're going out and photographing, not in a way where I'm photographing, where I'm literally putting things in, you're responsible for everything inside that frame. Or we're responsible for everything inside that frame. Like it's not like if you were Stephen Shore talks about this sometimes, like if you were a novelist, you wouldn't necessarily be like, and then there was I think he uses this example, like then there was a lamp that was just behind, so-and-so's head, right? Like it's like, if you wouldn't put it in the novel, then don't put it in the photograph, right? Or move your angle so the lamp isn't behind the person's head. So I see this so much as, it's almost like the restraint and discipline of the lens is so important to me, because it's like the quality of describing the outside world. So even though I'm constructing these elaborate tableau, it's still the world. I'm still very much like a diorama, in the sense that, we were talking about this earlier, that in a diorama, you see like it's a landscape from the desert, that you might not see those specimens in a 3-week journey or over a course of 7 years hiking in the desert, but they're all like condensed and consolidated in a kind of hyper-real way in the diorama, where there's like the rattlesnake and the perfect cactus specimen, and right. So it's kind of like that. So I think of these pieces as having some of that same kind of thing, where there's this sort of hyper-real consolidation of elements. In this piece, I will say that I have Lisa to thank for this piece, because when we first started talking about the show, we were talking a lot about the importance of seasons. And I really hadn't done anything with winter. Very challenging idea to kind of figure out how I would do something with winter. I kind of worked my way towards it with a piece that came just before this, which is the largest piece I've ever made. It's 13 feet. And it has little little dusting of snow, and it has little icicles. So it's kind of late November, early winter. But then the full-on winter where the negative space becomes icy and pale and white was very, very new and very technically and conceptually and visually exciting and challenging. So here I was collecting icicles with the help of my husband over here, collecting like giant chunks of ice from nearby waterfalls, lashing them to my structures so they wouldn't tumble off, using a combination of real and fake snow, and then making little kind of, what do you call them? Like, what are we calling them? Snakesicles and birds. Like I would use things that I had in my freezer. Like I have a freezer full of like snakes and frogs. So I would take them, put them in little Tupperware with water, freeze them, and you get like a little fossil, a little ice fossil. So you can see, like, I keep pointing over here, but I don't know if you can see the snakes that are in ice, or there's like a jawbone, there's all these little things that are kind of embedded in ice, but also very summery things. There's delphinium, there's cardinals. So I like the idea of making absolutely literal this idea of like hibernation or all of the seasons being present at any single season, even winter.
And I know we've talked about it earlier today because we've done docent training and Tanya's been talking to people, but I don't think we've mentioned here that you photograph, once the composition's finished, you make like 30 to 40 frames and then knit them together. So what you're seeing in the photographs are things that you wouldn't see them that way with the naked eye, nor with the camera. Naturally you see it that way if she only made one frame. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and maybe we could even show the film after.
Oh, yeah.
Should we do that? But yeah, so out of a desire really for, I really wanted to work large, but I did not, it was extremely important to me. It was crucial that when the viewer came in close, they wouldn't be disappointed. Because I've had that experience where I'm like, wow, and then I'm like, oh, and then you feel like you have to be back at least 6 feet, 7 feet. Not like when you're looking at a Chuck Close painting or an abstract expressionist painting or impressionism, even that relationship to the physical paint mark. So in photography, I wanted description, right? Like just the lusciousness of description. So in order to get that, I moved away from using my view camera, which was a little hard for me to let go because I've been using the same view camera I had been using it since 1991, and moving to digital very skeptically, but it was like for a purpose, for a visual and conceptual purpose, which was to give this kind of very democratic sense of description where a little, where a little leaf on the upper right-hand corner would be described with like the same level of respect and nuance as something in the center of the frame. So to do this, you can see my frame, and this is a big print out in my yard, and some of these things from my collection. These are some of my icicles. I'll get back to that. Yeah, like a little rose that's in number 31, cardinal that's also in 31, collecting skunk cabbage, which then I freeze, and then I use this spring skunk cabbage in number 30, the big 13-foot one, and that enables me to sort of put things together that couldn't happen in nature. You wouldn't have snow and juvenile skunk cabbage at the same time. Then I sculpt. I love fire. Then I sculpt them with a torch, and then kind of embed them in the scene. So this is working on woven 31. Someone told me that pokeweed plant is carcinogenic and I shouldn't touch it with my bare hands. Here I'm like posing a little snake. Didn't actually end up staying there. So it's a kind of a combination when I'm working of like being highly intuitive, obsessive and, but like a kind of extreme focused attention to both detail and whole at the same time. The fire is really important though. There's a lot of fire in the film, partly because it's fun to film, but partly because it's sort of almost like a way of expediting some of the natural cycles of life and decay that happens in the natural world. So I'll make kind of layers, like this is where I'm starting a new piece on a new frame, and I'll burn layers of leaves and then wet it down, and it kind of makes it sort of gives me the sense of possibility and something very like organic about the way that it almost is like working with a canvas. Yeah. Oh yeah, the leaf in the corner. So the method that I ended up using is just where I take maybe 3 rows of 10 frames with a fair amount of overlap of content, and then those frames, I stitch them together in Photoshop. So it also means that it's a little bit, it's different than my view camera photographs that are taken from one single lens at one moment, because it becomes a kind of, it's whole, but it is a collection of moments. Not over months, but over a few hours anyway. And so there's a change. There's more of a kind of like scanning democratic description of objects across the plane of the picture plane. And post-production takes at least as long as creating the scene on the structure.
Can you describe the frame you keep talking about? Is this like an empty frame that is your shape?
Yeah, so it's it's in here. You can kind of see it here. It's kind of like a garden bed, which is at a 45-degree angle. I can't really have it I can't have it straight up and down because everything would fall off. But I also can't have it flat on the ground because I actually experimented with that a little bit, but then the objects have no gravity. So it seemed actually like, and even some of the difficulty I have with things that can fall off if I'm not careful is actually important to the sense that you're sort of like, are you looking at a wall? Are you looking at the ground? Some sense of ambiguity there. And then I guess it's in the movie, you see, you see the frame before it has anything on it, and it's kind of terraced so that the dirt and things will kind of stick on there without dropping off. But I don't know if we want to. Oh, I can go forward. No, it doesn't. It's okay. We'll just wave it. I think it's like the next one. So that's the back of it. It's been revised. So you can see like kind of the terracing there. Yeah.
Want to open it up for questions?
Sure. Yeah, and we
Or do you
just
want to? Yeah.
That's all right. Yeah, there were some images here that just have always been really important, like certainly Adam and Eve. This is a Lucas Cranach of that moment just before the fall, which is of course a favorite in art history. A little detail there of the apple. And then much more contemporary, like this is a Gorky. Helped me figure out woven number 30, the very pale wintry one, the sort of way that for me, I'm using literal branches as gestures, but kind of inspired by Gorky and Cy Twombly. These are hunting tapestries that are in the V&A that were particularly important in working on number 17. Thank you. This is made up of about, some 20 or so deer heads, deer antlers. And But in the medieval tapestries, hunting would be like a very ceremonial, highly ritualized activity, and would certainly be presented that way in tapestry and in painting. And the taking of a single animal would have kind of religious importance, and would be highly ritualized. So this piece is partly about kind of excess plunder, right, rather than this single animal. There's many, but trying to work with it in such a way that even though there's still blood on the antlers and you can see the fur, and in a couple of cases you can see the eyes of the deer still there, I'm still looking for that kind of magical fairy tale quality, or the way that a kind of duality between the animals kind of sinking into the earth and rising up out of it.
Maybe describe where you got all those deer heads.
Yeah.
So people's minds.
Yeah, I got them. I just got them. There's some little snippets of that in the film too. There's a cardboard box filled with these deer heads. But I wanted to make a piece featuring antlers, and then I was like, do I get them on eBay? Like, what do we? So I ended up calling a local slaughterhouse, where it's just a small slaughterhouse in my community, which we have a lot of hunters, and this lovely guy had me come over and then handed me this box, and they were like sort of where people would have their deer processed, and they were going to pick up the antlers and like sort of the cranium to have them mounted, and then they never picked them up, so they're just really smelly and bloody. So I was like, oh wow. But so it completely changed, right? I had this sort of idea of something kind of pristine, like the antlers without the body, but then I had something else. So the piece went in a different direction, but very challenging to make, partly because I couldn't leave them on the set as I was working on it, because if I did, the next door neighbor's dog and other things would just come and take them away, which I found out the hard way. And then, so I had to sort of have like placeholder deer heads, and then know where they were going to go and put them.
Where did you put them? In the freezer?
No, I put them up on top of the scaffold. They didn't fit in the freezer. I didn't have a large enough freezer. So, yeah.
We should one thing, yeah, we should take questions, but I wanted to talk maybe because we didn't show the Pollock, and there I feel like there's a interesting relationship there to his gestures and your comments about how you needed to have it at a 45-degree angle for yours to work. But of course, Pollock painted, or at least there's that famous picture of him painting on the floor. And so thinking about that sort of distinction and what it means to paint this way, or paint on the wall, and the gestures of the branches, I was struck by the relationship.
No, I mean the one that you just referred to, woven number 11, was really the most directly inspired by Pollock, but in so many of these, I'm thinking about this, because there's that relationship between like part to whole and that sense of energy. But of course, I'm working with things that are described very literal. They're all literal things. It's not abstract at all. So I kind of love that there's, I mean, for me, that's just been a really rich point of conversation with this other artist that I look at all the time, about like, how do you get the eye to move from one side to the other? What can feel like a gesture, even if it's a thing? What is the relationship between abstraction and description? How do you create the sense of space when something's pretty flat? Like his canvas is flatter than the thing that I'm photographing. It's two-dimensional with the exception of the thickness of the paint. So it's very, very different, and yet I feel like it's a kind of way that I'm bouncing back and forth with those ideas when I'm making these.
So those are my questions. I'm sure some of you have additional questions, so let me open it up to you.
So, have you ever, this is a crazy question, possibly, but have you ever had a bad juncture due to the elapsed time between the photographing the sessions?
You mean in the stitching?
Yeah, like where time has gone by, and so the two pieces, they don't match anymore.
So not that much time has gone by. So the only, maybe between frame 1 and frame 30, there might be an hour or two, but the shoot happens all in one day.
Okay.
So there might be slight differences in the light, which I try to adjust in the file, like the clouds come and, the light might change. But I try to make the files as even as possible before I stitch them
Oh, yeah, I
together.
didn't think of that part, but the light is more likely the light is a lot faster to change than any kind of bio decay or anything, right?
Right, so as I've been working with more and more living creatures, it can get tricky because I might be on the bottom row and almost to the end, and then the frog might move in a slightly more flattening angle, and then I'll back up, and it can get very, very confusing to figure out which frame I'm using, and it just gets a little more complicated. But in terms of the stitching, the amount of time that's elapsed has not been an issue. It's not like I start when I'm first composing the piece. Right, it all happens on a single day.
Can you explain stitching?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So it's funny that stitching is sort of a tapestry term, right? And in a way I actually think of sort of a pixel as a nice analogy to a stitch, just literally a stitch, not as in Photoshop stitching. And the way that I was talking before about the thing in the center weighted lens versus this more multi-view composite. So in stitching, Photoshop has a very good algorithm. If you create a number of frames with enough overlap of content, you can select those files and tell it to stitch. And there's various options of how you tell it to do this. It's very, very good if you give it the right material and you know what it's trained and programmed to do. Exactly. Yeah.
Technological.
Yeah, so it's just matching up the content that it sees and blending it. Yeah.
Talk
Yeah.
about what
Yeah.
So do you overlap your frames as you shoot in Photoshop?
Yeah, so if they're not overlapped enough, you're just going to have a gap or a seam. So you have to overlap them by at least a third as I'm shooting them. Yeah.
Are you talking about layers?
No, I'm not
Okay.
talking about layers. So layers come later. These might have as many as, I'm sorry if this is a little too techy or whatever, but once I have this thing that I've, which has been stitched together, but I do want to just back up and say, this method, right, it's great that Photoshop can do this, but it's just it's like a means to an end, I love that Photoshop is capable of doing this because it makes it possible for me to use the technology for this purpose. But at the same time, I'm not really that interested in it, sort of in and of itself. I would never in a million years have thought of just trying this out. It's sort of just once I sort of had this vision of this thing with certain requirements that I wanted about moving in close and being able to back up and the scale, then it's I'll go to any lengths to figure it out and figure out any technical thing or physical thing or any trip to the depths of the forest to get the thing that I'm looking for. But it's not the technical thing in and of itself, right? But, so layers are different. They're adjustment layers. It's part of non-destructive editing. So if I want to work on the color, work on the contrast, work on many, many things, I add what are called layers to the file. And that enables you to edit a file without actually changing the initial.
Are you photographing sequentially? Is that what I'm understanding?
So if you picture this big,
Well, the picture behind you, are you photographing it
yeah, so I would,
sequentially?
yeah, I would start on the upper right and move across. I'm sorry, that's the left. That'd be the left. So you start on the upper left and then take about 10 frames until I get to the right, then a middle row, which also has to overlap in the vertical realm, not just the horizontal, and then make another row, and then, so it's really actually, like, it's complicated, but it's also really not that complicated.
What
Right,
type-
I'm just taking 3 rows of 10 pictures with a lot of overlap, making them as even as I can, and then stitching them together later. I will say though that before I get to the phase where I stitch them together, I always take some low-res files during the day of the shoot, do a very quick, fast stitch, because the stitching can take forever. I can like cook my kids for dinner. There's some stories about that. So I could, you know what I'm saying? So it could be very slow. So I would just do like a very quick stitch to be able to see the thing as a photograph. Right? So that's actually a very important stage of the final, and then I might make a few final adjustments. I do that during even just using my phone. Set it for a panoramic image, get up on my scaffold, just to be able to be like almost as a sketch, to see it as a photograph, not as the frame. I've gotten better and better at sort of anticipating what that's going to look like. I have to get up and down the frame on the scaffold to see it from where the camera is going to see it, right? There's like you could have a flower or a skunk cabbage angle that if it's like this, like maybe the camera's going to see the top of it, not the part that I want it to see or to record or to describe.
What type of camera do you use?
I use a Nikon D800.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then I'm going to be switching over to a medium format digital camera that I have. But yeah, I use that.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So you work undercover, I think, from,
Yes.
okay, so, because the sun moves very fast in the sky, right? And unless you take multiple exposures, say, to stitch them together for light, know that. So it the sun would change a great deal during, its angle on your object during a shoot that is this long and complicated. So the light is shaded
Right.
as it falls on your canvas.
Exactly. So the tent serves many purposes. It enables me to keep all kinds of things out there without them being rained and snowed upon. But really the most important function in a way is it creates like, it's like a huge light box. And it diffuses the light. It creates a very even, generous, I like the word democratic. I know I've used it in other ways, but a kind of democratic light across the frame.
That you can count on.
That I can count on, exactly. This piece, by the time I was finally getting it right, the milkweed was blowing all over the place. And so there will be times when I'll do a shoot and I'll have to do the whole thing of shooting 30 frames, and I can see that I just haven't gotten it and I have to start again. So in this one, it was getting dark by the time I felt like I was beginning to get it, and I lose the focus a little bit on the bottom row. And it had this like very strong blue cast, and in the beginning I took out the cast when I was working on it in Photoshop, and then I eventually put it back in because it was like nearly nocturnal. So this one's a little different than the others because of that, because of the time of day and the quality of the light. But for the most part, that tent really does serve that purpose of making a kind of consistency of the light. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to, because there's a movie in here tonight, we are gonna move down to the gallery and have Tanya sign books, and so I'm sorry to interrupt the questions because it's really fascinating to hear.
But ask me questions.
But let's ask the questions down there. Thank you.